Hello, I'm Dr. Kegan Chandler, and welcome to Exploring Religion. In today's episode, we're going to be introducing the subject of new religious movements, groups sometimes referred to by scholars as new religions, and perhaps unfortunately labeled cults by the dominant institutions of society. But as we'll discover, exactly what a new religious movement is a highly challenging question. And the question of whether we should be using the term cult to refer to any groups is also very difficult and highly controversial. Though I won't be getting as much into this latter question, today I'll be focusing primarily on what I believe a new religious movement is and how we should be using that word. And later in this episode, I'll also be saying some probably fairly controversial things about the category of denominations as well. So get ready for lots of controversy through and through. And I do feel like I should apologize up front once again for my voice being a little weak on this episode. I am once more getting over being sick. It is just part of being a dad. If you have lots of kids, you're going to have lots of blessings, but you'll also have lots of germs as well. So please do bear with me. Now, I want to start this episode by mentioning that NRM studies is an important field of research for me personally. In fact, I did my dissertation on Japanese religions and specifically focused on issues related to several new religious movements in Japan, with the Japanese term for these groups being Shinshukyo, or literally new religions. And by the way, I also have a book coming out on all of this called Monotheism in the New Religious Movements of Japan. And I'm definitely going to be making a good deal of content on this channel related to this and to Japanese NRMs in general. But as an introduction, I think it's going to be critical that we first address new religious movements more broadly, and specifically the category or the term NRM and what scholars of religion have meant by it, and also what I mean by it personally. And I do think that getting clear on the category of NRM is really important for a lot of different reasons, but it's also somewhat difficult. NRM studies continues to be a rather contentious field, and I think this is in part because of the serious interest that broader society outside of academia has taken in what we call NRMs, or rather, in what popular discussions refer to as cults. And just a quick spoiler, I am not at all a fan of this term cult. And in fact, I strongly discourage it. And though this is not really an episode about the term cult, that would get us into a range of sociological and psychological issues. But the truth is that we're not going to be able to talk about this category of NRM unless we, at least to some extent, talk about the term cult, since NRM is used now as an alternative to a certain popular usage of cult. Scholars in my field of religious studies have long pointed out that the term cult was originally a historical term, a neutral category often used by historians to describe the organized worship of a deity. However, in the late 19th and 20th centuries, North American evangelicals redefined the term. They turned it into a pejorative term through waves of anti-cult literature published by Christian anti-cult ministries, or ACMs. These ministries and their related theologians transformed the word cult into a polemical weapon which could be used against their theological rivals. Anyone who didn't believe in broadly orthodox or usually mainstream Protestant Christian doctrines, this was enough to make you a cultist. For example, if you didn't believe in the doctrine of the Trinity or the deity of Christ especially, that was enough to put you in this category of cult. And there are many early examples of this evangelical anti-cult literature. Possibly one of the earliest examples is William C. Irvine's Timely Warnings from 1917, later published as Heresies Exposed from 1921 onward. There was a whole slew of editors. But this here is probably the most famous and most influential book for American Protestant churches since the 1960s, The Kingdom of the Cults by Walter Martin, first published in 1965. On the cover of this edition that I'm showing here, it markets itself as the definitive work on the subject and as the leading cult reference tool. So This book sort of presents itself as a more neutral, scholarly guide, but the truth is that it is a clearly theological text, a polemical text, which attempts to promote a certain kind of evangelical Christianity at the expense of its theological rivals. And it ultimately describes these groups, groups that it just doesn't like, as not only deviant in terms of doctrine, but also dangerous in terms of psychology. It identifies certain psychological or behavioral characteristics that it identifies with cults, and then attempts to find those traits in its theological rivals. Since the 1960s and 1970s, scholars of religion have reacted quite negatively to this pejorative use of cult by anti-cult ministries like that of Walter Martin and others, including psychologists and journalists who have also used the term cult. And scholars have mostly cautioned against this because they have found that the term cult is analytically unhelpful on the one hand, but they've also warned that it's even socially harmful or potentially harmful because governments and other dominant institutions of society have used this term cult in order to alienate certain groups of people, to delegitimize them, to segregate them from the category of real religions or respectable religions, and so to ultimately make them the targets of marginalization and even persecution. However, as far as I can tell, all of these scholarly warnings about the term cult seem to have fallen on deaf ears, at least in the realm of public discourse. In fact, while scholars have consistently discouraged the use of the term cult, the word has only gained an increasing traction in Western popular culture and journalism. And you can see this increase in popular usage by doing English language search results or looking them up on Google Trends. And you can see there's a frequent use of cult that's only been increasing in later years. And you can also turn on the television or search the term on Amazon or on Barnes and Noble or other bookstores, and you can see that lots of new books and programs are continuing to use this word, especially in post-COVID era political rhetoric. I could reference, for example, Steve Hassan's The Cult of Trump as a prominent example. You can also browse streaming sites like Netflix and see a rise in popularity of cult exposés, many of which have the word cult quite prominently in their titles. For example, there's Heaven's Gate, The Cult of Cults from 2020, and also the film How to Become a Cult Leader from 2023, just to name a few examples. So I think from a variety of avenues, you can recognize a persistent and overwhelmingly negative framing of groups using the term cult, and for a variety of different reasons. And so I suggest that this fact alone um, indicates the need for continued scholarly assessment of where this cult language came from and how it's been used and what its implications are for the people that it's targeting. But despite all I've said about how most scholars are warning people away from this term, I do need to mention that in recent years, there have been something of a minority of scholars who have begun to identify at least some heuristic potential in the word cult as a possible means of describing the personal experiences of ex-members and abuse survivors. But again, the majority have continued to strongly discourage the use of this term because, as the famed J. Gordon Melton has demonstrated, the word cult, it now simply is used to refer to a group that somebody doesn't like. And so it's therefore now overall less helpful for the study of religions, since it's not used for purposes of classification or for understanding of religions, but rather it's used for the denouncement and the denigration of religions. And if you're interested in all of this, by the way, I actually gave a public lecture at the end of 2024 at the UCA conference in Little Rock, Arkansas, on cult rhetoric and specifically how it's been weaponized against non-Trinitarian, Unitarian Christology in a Christian theological context. That presentation is pretty pretty detailed and has lots of colorful slides. So I hope if you're interested in this subject of cult or NRMs, and especially if you're as interested in Christian theology as I am, I hope you'll check that lecture out. And I'll put a link in the description of this episode to make it easy for you to find. But picking back up on the history of the term cult, again, in the 1960s and 1970s, like I mentioned, scholars of religion reacted quite strongly to the use of this term cult. And so they decided that we needed to counter this negative framing of religions by providing an alternative to cult. For example, the term new religions, and also perhaps the more successful term, new religious movements, or NRMs, which is my own preferred term. It is interesting to me as a researcher of Japanese NRMs, that the academic study of NRMs in the West evidently owes some of its vocabulary to research on Japanese religions. As I mentioned earlier, one alternative term to cult has been new religions. And this is in fact a translation of a Japanese term, Shinshukyo. This is a term which scholars in Japan have used since World War II to describe emerging religious phenomena in Japanese history. Prior to this, some groups developing in the early to mid 19th century had been thought of as sects or denominations of Shinto. In the 1880s, the Japanese government actually created a category for these groups. They put 13 groups in this category that they called sect Shinto or Kyoha Shinto. And this was a category made to distinguish these groups as private religious organizations, which could be distinguished from what we call state Shinto, which was held to be something more secular. But that's another story entirely. But as far as I can tell, this term Shinshukyo, or new religions, and some other related categories, this first appeared in post-war journalism and was later adopted by academics. For example, Murakami Shigeyoshi, in his influential work Research on the Contemporary History of Folk Religions from 1958, and also Takagi Hiru, who published Japanese Newly Arisen Religions, or Nihon no Shinko Shukyo, in 1959. And Shinko Shukyo, this is another term or a variant of this kind of category, new religions. It means newly arisen religions. So it's being fairly specific in terms of what seems new about these groups. But since the mid 1980s or so, new religions or Shinshukyo, this has been a standard term in Japanese religious studies, thanks also to the prominent work of famed scholars like Inoue Nobutaka and Shimazona Susumu. However, in recent years, the term new religions has fallen out of favor among many Western scholars. This souring on new religions has been due to concerns that scholars have had over the potential negative connotations of this term. Now, you might wonder, well, new religions, what's wrong with that? That sounds a lot better than cult. Well, one possible critique is that the term seems to emphasize novelty, and it seems to do it in this unqualified way, which perhaps implies that these groups are fundamentally different from these older religions or more established religions. It seems to imply that they are, in fact, distinct and new religions, as in recently emerging religions. And one of the Japanese terms I just mentioned, actually, Shinko Shukyo, or newly arisen religions, there clearly seems to be such an emphasis here. But the problem with this sort of emphasis is that this focus on newness can unintentionally support some of the polemical rhetoric that is found between interreligious disputes. In such interreligious disputes, sometimes groups labeled new religions, they are labeled this way in order to cast them as inauthentic or as divergent or as different from another group, which is claiming to be the more legitimate or authentic or older version of this tradition. And of course, the problem with this is that many NRMs are simply going to assert the exact opposite about themselves. They're going to insist that their teachings are actually the older teachings compared to those of their rivals, or that their group is the most faithful to the original doctrines of a shared religious tradition or a founder of a religion. For example, compare the claims of the Jehovah's Witnesses, which is a group that scholars often want to label an NRM. Compare the teachings of the Jehovah's Witnesses about Jesus, about the teachings of Jesus. Compare that to what the Roman Catholic Church says about the teachings of Jesus. Both of these groups say that theirs represents the most original or most faithful or most authentic version of Jesus' teachings and therefore of Christianity. Um, so, when scholars of religion impose the concept of newness in our categories, we have to be careful because this kind of usage, this kind of language can lead to a sort of automatic imposition of a hierarchical contrast between these groups, which is one step away from implying or supporting the idea that the new religions are deviant or impure or inferior to the older tradition. Now, of course, if you're a theologian, theologians may be happy to impose these connotations on rival groups or on those people whose ideas they think are wrong or harmful. But for scholars of religion, for historians who are aiming to remain as neutral as possible regarding these kind of claims to legitimacy that are made by religions, we have to be careful because our very use of certain terms like new can risk perpetuating certain theological biases, which is just something that's outside of our jurisdiction. Now, another more widely preferred term is the category new religious movements. And again, this is what I myself prefer to use. This category was first popularized by missionary scholar Harold W. Turner in the late 1960s and used by him throughout the 70s and 80s. And I like this word much better because it seems to carefully avoid at least some of the pitfalls of the term new religions. And it does so by replacing religions, the word religions, with the word movements. To me, this seems ultimately to be more inclusive. It allows for the study of a broader range of religious phenomena, from large, rigidly structured organizations to small, informal, or embryonic human networks. And importantly, the term can also be seen as allowing for the idea that some NRMs may be thought of as analogically as natural growths or extensions of established religious traditions, rather than as entirely distinct entities that are doing something completely different from earlier religions or groups or ideas that they're related to. So, phenomena which we describe as movements rather than distinct religions might be imagined to grow within already established religions. We might think that, well, there has been some discernible development, but whatever developments have taken place, they may not have ultimately severed their umbilical link to their parent faith. Maybe NRM could be taken to imply that there is now a new branching path, but one which is still connected to an original branch. Hence my image of the branching pine here on the screen. So an NRM may be merely a new growth or an offshoot of a parent tradition, which nevertheless remains connected to its parent faith. Of course, on the other hand, you could think of this term differently. A new religious movement might, for some people, invoke an image of a new pivot away from or an abandonment of an already established religion. Or alternatively, again, it might even suggest a more consciously independent religious development, which makes few or no claims about the past. So there's quite a lot of flexibility I see that's embedded within this term NRM. And I think that's its strength for those scholars who are trying to be as fair or as neutral as they possibly can be when dealing with religions and also with disputes between religions. Now, what makes an NRM? Well, again, this is a highly controversial question. As I mentioned earlier, many evangelical Christian theologians have identified a cult as a group which deviates from what they think is orthodox doctrine. So they've given a theological definition to cult and also to new religious movement. I've seen plenty of evangelical anti-cult books treat the category of cults and new religions and new religious movements as synonymous. Of course, this sort of theological definition that they're working with, this isn't going to work for historians or sociologists or scholars of religion. But still, the proper definition of NRM has been debated extensively in these circles, with some scholars ending up using criteria that I think are maybe less helpful than others. Excuse me. It is clear to me that some definitions of NRM used by scholars of religion are actually highly problematic and should be avoided. For example, scholars have sometimes emphasized charismatic leadership as a defining trait of NRMs. And I've put an image here on the screen of a Pied Piper leading a bunch of children along. Since this is essentially what many people have in mind when they think of a group like this, they just imagine people going along even almost against their will, as if in a trance, led by some charismatic individual. But to me, this seems immediately to be a very poor definition for an NRM for a few reasons. First of all, because defining an NRM by charismatic leadership is ultimately going to place far too much focus on the personal quality of an individual rather than embracing the genuinely religious nature or religious character of the phenomenon itself. Oftentimes in anti-cult literature, from psychologists and journalists as well, not just evangelical anti-cult ministries, these sources will promote the idea of brainwashing or of mind control as a fundamental feature of all NRMs or of all cults. And this idea of brainwashing, by the way, is highly debatable and a regularly discouraged theory. And if you're interested, you should take a look at the work of J. Gordon Melton and also James Richardson's recent takedown of what is called the myth of the omnipotent leader and the myth of the passive brainwashed follower. And I concur that an emphasis on the charisma of a leader and a definition of NRM is ultimately misguided, since it is clear that many groups considered mainstream or orthodox, they also are going to have charismatic leaders, and many of them will have intensely devoted followers. So this is just not a good way to define NRMs compared to other religions, and I really do think that it does have some negative implications. Now, another popular criteria for NRM among scholars is syncretism. Syncretism, this is a category which refers to the blending or borrowing of different religions or cultural traditions. Scholars who study NRMs in colonial contexts, especially, will sometimes promote syncretism as a defining trait of NRMs. For example, when Spanish missionaries came to the Americas, the resulting religious developments among the pre-existing peoples was a blend of Roman Catholicism and other indigenous spiritual traditions. Some people will point to this blending and say, that's an NRM. That's an NRM emerging there. And I do think that this blending and borrowing dynamic is certainly visible in many NRMs. For example, in the Japanese NRMs that I study, for example, Kurozumikyo, Tenrikyo, Konkokyo, and others, there clearly seems to be a distinct or significant mixing of religious ideas going on here. though in the case of these movements, they were certainly not the byproduct of Western missionary activity. However, using syncretism as a defining trait for NRMs ends up being problematic. The term syncretism itself is highly contested, highly debated, with some scholars arguing that this category of syncretism has very little or even no taxonomic value in the study of religions, though others do see it as still a very useful descriptive category. And I'm one of those latter scholars, by the way, but I won't get into that here. But another reason, perhaps the most important reason, why using syncretism as a defining trait of NRMs is problematic is because scholars have recognized that syncretic processes or blending and borrowing processes, these are not at all unique to what scholars want to call NRMs. Syncretism is actually intrinsic to the evolution of all religious traditions, and it even seems basic to the development of human culture in general. So, defining NRMs by syncretism, this risks overlooking the ways that more established religions have also adapted to their social environments, to their political and cultural environments, and changes in those environments. And again, this ultimately contributes negatively to how we understand religions. Rulings like, well, this religion doesn't blend and borrow, and that one does. This kind of description is going to imply to many people that, well, this one religion that doesn't blend and borrow is pure. It's something that fell down out of heaven, untouched, unsullied by the world. And meanwhile, their rival group, which is accused of blending and borrowing, this religion is therefore less pure, less divine, and more secular. And I think we'll want to just do our very best to avoid these kinds of implications in our definitions. Now, another common and I think problematic criterion for NRMs is the idea of innovation, of doing something new. However, I do think that this idea of innovation might be the most useful of the bunch we've discussed here. Of course, the concept of innovation or doing something new can apply to doctrines. It can apply to rituals or organizational structures. But as we've already talked about, this idea of newness can be quite complicated. And if we're not careful with it, it can have some really negative implications. What counts as new can vary greatly across cultures and across different contexts. And as I mentioned, focusing too narrowly on innovation, however we define that, is going to risk reinforcing biases, such as those, again, found in evangelical anti cult rhetoric, for example, which labels groups as cults based on perceived doctrinal innovations or departures from orthodoxy. But I do think, as I just mentioned, that this idea of newness or innovation actually gives us a good clue. It gives us a good start. But rather than defining an NRM through a doctrinal definition, I suggest we should define an NRM by its institutional or organizational innovation. While I agree that newness should be central in any definition of new religious movement, I suggest we should define NRMs more simply as movements founded since the 19th century, movements whose institutional origins have emerged since the 19th century. Now, I'm grounding NRM like this because, first of all, the word new, this is obviously a relative term. It must be firmly anchored in any definition to some historical period or another. And I think this temporal and institutional focus ends up being rather objective. And I think it avoids overly subjective criteria like doctrinal innovation or doctrinal or ritual syncretism. Of course, if we agree with this, that there should be temporal and institutional axes in our definition of NRM. The difficulty then arises when we try to determine exactly where those temporal boundaries should fall while trying to maintain as pragmatically broad a definition of NRM as possible. Scholar Eileen Barker once said that we should identify NRMs as movements founded since World War II. Okay. But that would exclude a lot of movements that scholars have wanted to call NRMs. So we do need to choose some point in time, but we should also try to allow for a degree of helpful imprecision and pick the best period of time that we see seems to capture as many of the groups that scholars wish to target with this category. And I think we can do this by broadly defining an NRM as a religious movement whose organizational founding has occurred since the 19th century. So from the 19th century onward. Now, you're probably wondering, well, why the 19th century? And again, this is on the one hand, pragmatically, because I see that most of the groups that scholars have wanted to target with this word fall into this period when we look at their institutional beginnings, fall into this period and onward. However, it might also be that anchoring our definition of NRM to the 19th century is both pragmatic but also historically significant. This period in world history, excuse me, the 19th century, this period saw dramatic sociocultural and political changes, including industrialization, colonialism, globalization. These are forces which many scholars say contributed in some way to the emergence of many new religious movements around the world. For example, Japan's cultural and political transformation prior to and during the Meiji Restoration of the 19th century. This brought about significant religious shifts and also the rise of the movements that I just mentioned, Kurozumikyo, Tenrikyo, Konkokyo, and others. And I won't get too much into the historical details here. I am just raising the possibility that there may end up being significant historical reason for tying our definition of NRM to the 19th century and not before. But ultimately, all of this is debatable. And again, I'd rather focus more on my pragmatic approach to attaching NRM to a certain period of time, whatever time that might be. Now, if you say, okay, Kegan, I'll go along with this idea that an NRM is something that is at least institutionally new. And okay, I'll also go along with this idea that it should be tied to some period of time. And okay, the 19th century sounds as good as any. Your next question is probably going to be as to how long a new movement continues to count as being new. When does an NRM stop being new? And this is a very fair question, a very good question. The question of how long a new movement remains new has actually led to some rather creative solutions in Japanese studies. For example, Nishiyama's use of terms like Shin Shukyo or new religions for groups that were founded in the late 1970s and 1980s. For example, Kofuku no Kagaku or Happy Science, or the well-known and infamous Shinrikyo. Similarly, in the West, Eileen Barker has also proposed categories like first generation NRMs, second and third generation NRMs. And I do think that this general approach is pretty useful. But I also think that it risks becoming unwieldy over time. We can imagine one day having new religions, right? At some point. Eventually, this pattern is going to break down in its utility. So I suggest instead, quite simply, that as movements age, as newer ones emerge, I suggest the label NRM can simply shift forward in history. One day, maybe when we're in the late 21st century, we may need to collectively say, okay, NRMs are those religious movements founded since the mid 20th century, for example. And I don't really think that a shifting definition will be inappropriate in this case, especially from a historical standpoint. And what I mean by that is this: I see that every religion was at some point new. There was a time when Christianity was new. There was a time when Christianity was even persecuted on the public perception of its newness. Buddhism also at one point was a new movement. And I think that all of these so-called great religions or world religions, if we have to use those terms, all of these were at one point perceived as new, or were at least institutionally new, I should say. There was a point in which they were founded, and therefore a point in which they were each NRMs in their own respective historical contexts. So, again, excuse me, from a historical perspective, it seems like we should, in this rare case, be okay with a definition of NRM, which we know is going to need to be updated in time. But this is just my own thoughts on the matter. Maybe you've thought about this or will think about this. Maybe you'll come up with something better. Please leave a comment on this episode. I'd love to hear what you think. In the meantime, using this broad time and institution based definition, I think we can apply this category of NRM quite successfully to a number of movements which scholars have wanted to target. For example, the Japanese movements that I study, for example, Nyorai-kyo, Kurozumi-kyo, Tenri-kyo, and Kanko-kyo, these all fit very comfortably in this category of NRM, since all three were established in the 19th century. But also, in a Christian context, which seems quite relevant, I think, since the popular use of the term cult and these other reactionary terms like NRM, since these emerge out of Christian doctrinal disputes, you might be wondering, how should new religions fit there when we're talking about different Christianities? And you'll see here again that the groups that scholars have most often wanted to target, groups like the Jehovah's Witnesses, the Christadelphians, the Seventh-day Adventists, these are groups which can also comfortably fit in this category, since they each had their institutional foundings since the 19th century. Now, you might also be wondering, what about other Christian groups? What about Christian groups which haven't historically been targeted with this use and this term NRM? What about what we call denominations? What is the difference between an NRM and a denomination? I won't spend too much time here since this video has already gone on a little long. But I do think that we should be very careful with this term denomination. And I'll say just a few things. I see that just as the term cult is a category that nobody wants to be labeled with, I see that in some contexts, in Christianity especially, the term denomination seems to be a word that some people covet. The question is, who gets this coveted category of denomination? What exactly counts as a denomination? What makes a Christian group a mere denomination rather than a new religious movement? This is a fascinating question. And I think it deserves our scrutiny because from my vantage point, the criteria that writers and historians and Christians themselves are using to identify denominations, this is not very clear. When I look into this, I get the sense that we have fallen into the same problems with the positive use of denomination that we did with the negative use of cult. It seems that for most people who are writing about Christian groups, it seems they'll often call a Christian group a denomination if they feel that it holds to certain core truths of Christianity, certain allegedly fundamental Orthodox doctrines. If there's a perceived theological innovation or a perceived deviation, well, it's no longer a denomination. It becomes a distinct new religious movement or a new religion. or worse, a cult. But again, on my definition, we locate new religious movements via temporal and institutional criteria, not doctrinal criteria. Now, some may also try to say, well, denominations are groups which are friendly to other groups. They acknowledge themselves as part of the broader Christian tradition, or they try to work together despite their differences. They try to reach across party lines. But the same could be said for other Christian groups, which are labeled with the category of NRM. A strong sectarianism can clearly be found in both mainstream groups or in groups who are on the margins. Some people might try to say, well, groups like the Jehovah's Witnesses or the Latter-day Saints, well, they shouldn't be considered a Christian denomination because they claim to be the one true church or God's chosen organization on earth. But the very same thing could be said for Roman Catholicism. And yet Catholicism doesn't get the same marginalizing treatment. They get that coveted category of denomination. So the question is, why is this the case? And again, when I look into it, I see that we seem to be making distinctions once again between denominations and NRMs on doctrinal grounds, on theological grounds, which is exactly what many scholars of religion say we should not do when it comes to identifying mere cults versus genuine religions. So, a lot to think about here. I'm sure this will have been very controversial for many of you, but hopefully this discussion has gotten your gears turning. In conclusion, I'll summarize all of this by saying that I find that the way that I'm trying to use the term new religious movement avoids or goes very far in avoiding contentious theological debates between groups. And I see that it provides also a more nonpartisan framework for studying a wider range of religious phenomena. Grounding the term NRM in a specific historical context allows us to work with a practical and more inclusive approach to understanding what are very interesting religious movements, which I think deserve to be taken seriously as human projects of understanding. But the way I'm using this category, it also allows for the inevitable evolution of the religious landscape, and therefore produces a quite flexible scholarly category. Excuse me. And ultimately, I'll be speaking much more on this show about new religious movements and related issues. I'll especially be focusing on the early Japanese new religious movements, some of which I mentioned in this episode. But until then, I hope you'll like or subscribe or share this video if you found it helpful. All of that activity will really help to get this channel off the ground. But until then, I hope you have enough to think about, and we'll see you next time on Exploring Religion. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.